They told Bob Marley his toe had to go. He said no. And in the 4 years that followed, almost no one asked him why. By 1977, Marley wasn't just a musician. He was the living embodiment of Rastafari to millions of people who had never set foot in Jamaica. He was proof that a colonized island could speak to the world on its own terms. He was expected to be unbreakable, invincible, aligned. And then a doctor in London told him his toe needed to be amputated. The injury had seemed small at first. A wound from football. Something that wouldn't heal. When the biopsy came back, it showed acrolentiginous melanoma, an aggressive cancer that had already begun spreading beneath the nail bed. The recommendation was immediate amputation. Remove the toe. Stop the spread. Survive. Marley said no. The public story became simple. Rastafari belief forbids amputation. The body must remain whole. But the private story was more complicated. Because Marley didn't reject all treatment. He sought other options. He consulted doctors in Miami, in New York, in Germany. He underwent experimental therapies. He tried to find a way to fight the cancer without sacrificing the toe. What the official narrative rarely mentions is that Marley's advisors were divided. Some urged him to amputate. Some supported his search for alternatives. And some reminded him that his body was no longer just his own. It belonged to a movement, to a message, to millions of people who saw him as living proof that their beliefs could withstand modern pressure. The context matters here. Rastafari isn't just a religion. It's a resistance movement born from colonial trauma, built on reclaiming Black identity and autonomy. The body, in Rastafari theology, is sacred and complete. To alter it is to compromise its integrity. But this belief exists within a larger framework of defiance against systems that have historically violated Black bodies without consent. For Marley, the amputation wasn't just a medical procedure. It was a symbolic capitulation. To the same Western medicine that had pathologized his people. To the same systems that had colonized his island. To the same logic that said survival required conformity. But there's another dimension to this that gets sanitized in the retelling. The medical establishment didn't just offer Marley a choice. It offered him certainty wrapped in statistics. Doctors presented amputation as the obvious answer, the rational decision, the only path a reasonable person would take. They didn't account for what rationality means when your entire existence has been defined by resisting exactly that kind of logic. The same institutions that diagnosed Marley had spent centuries treating Black bodies as subjects rather than patients. As problems to be managed rather than people to be healed. The history of medical experimentation on enslaved people. The forced sterilizations. The Tuskegee study that was still recent memory in 1977. This wasn't paranoia. This was pattern recognition. The doctors who examined Marley likely believed they were offering objective medical advice. They saw a disease, a solution, a clear path forward. What they didn't see was the weight of history in the examination room. The physicians who had built surgical techniques on enslaved bodies without consent. The gynecologists who experimented on Black women without anesthesia. The public health officials who watched syphilis destroy Black men for decades in the name of research. When a doctor tells you to sacrifice part of your body to survive, and your grandfather's body was mutilated by colonizers who used the same language of necessity, the decision becomes something other than medical. It becomes existential. And Marley was standing at the intersection of personal survival and collective memory. He kept touring, kept performing, kept speaking. The Exodus Tour, the Kaya Tour, sold out shows across Europe and America. He played through pain, through exhaustion, through a body that was visibly beginning to fail. Those who were there remember the limp, the way he favored his left leg. The moments between songs where he would close his eyes and steady himself. But on stage, under the lights, in front of thousands, he became what they needed him to be. Unshaken. Prophetic. The silence around his condition was deliberate. His management minimized it. His publicists deflected questions. Even those closest to him struggled to reconcile what they were watching happen with what they had been told to believe about him. Symbols don't weaken. Legends don't falter. And Marley was both. The machinery around him had become self-sustaining. Record labels had invested in the Bob Marley brand. Promoters had sold tickets based on his image. Media outlets had built narratives around his invincibility. Admitting vulnerability would have disrupted the revenue stream. It would have complicated the story. It would have introduced doubt into a product that was being sold on the promise of certainty. Island Records had turned Marley into their flagship artist. His albums weren't just releases, they were events. His tours weren't just concerts, they were pilgrimages. The financial architecture built around him required him to remain operational. Canceling shows meant refunding tickets. Postponing tours meant breaking contracts. Revealing the extent of his illness meant watching the carefully constructed market value collapse in real time. The industry had spent years positioning Marley as the voice of an entire movement. They had marketed him to audiences who wanted authenticity, resistance, truth. To reveal that the man behind the message was human, sick, frightened would have undermined the product they had spent millions developing and distributing. So the tours continued. The interviews stayed focused on the music, the message, the movement. Questions about his health were redirected. Concerns were dismissed as rumors. The performance of wellness became as choreographed as the concerts themselves. There were private moments. Conversations with family members where he admitted the fear. Meetings with doctors where the prognosis grew darker. But publicly, the message remained unchanged. He was fighting this his way. He would not compromise. He would not give in. And the people around him reinforced it. Not out of malice, but out of investment. They had built careers on Marley's consistency. They had staked reputations on his unwavering commitment to Rastafari principles. To suggest he compromised would be to admit their own complicity in creating an image that had become a cage. The music industry operates on mythology. It sells personas as much as songs. And once a mythology is established, maintaining it becomes everyone's job. The artist, the managers, the label, the media. They all become co-authors of a narrative that can't be rewritten without collapsing the entire structure. Marley understood this. He saw how his image had been weaponized, commodified, distributed. But he also understood that the image had power. It inspired people. It gave hope to communities that had been systematically stripped of it. To dismantle the mythology would be to remove the scaffolding that was holding up something larger than himself. In September 1980, Marley collapsed while jogging in Central Park. The cancer had spread to his brain, his lungs, his liver. He was admitted to a hospital in New York, then transferred to a clinic in Bavaria that specialized in unconventional cancer treatment. He spent his final months there, far from Jamaica, far from his family, in a place where almost no one spoke his language. The Bavarian clinic offered alternative therapies, immunotherapy, holistic approaches, treatments that promised to fight the cancer without requiring him to alter his body. But by the time he arrived, it was already too late. The cancer was systemic, the damage irreversible. The clinic itself operated in a gray zone between medicine and hope. It catered to patients who had exhausted conventional options, offering experimental treatments that existed outside the regulatory frameworks of mainstream medicine. Some treatments showed promise. Others were pure theater. All of them were expensive. For Marley, the clinic represented something specific. It was medicine on his terms. Treatment that didn't require symbolic surrender. Care that acknowledged his agency rather than demanding his compliance. But it was also desperation dressed in methodology. The final stop on a journey that had started with a football injury and ended with metastatic cancer. He never returned home alive. When Marley's body was flown back to Jamaica in May 1981, the state funeral drew hundreds of thousands of mourners. The Prime Minister gave a eulogy. The United Nations issued a tribute. But the questions that had followed him for 4 years remained unanswered. Not because they were hidden, but because almost no one had asked them directly. Did he refuse amputation because of belief, or because of what amputation would mean to the people who looked to him as a symbol of wholeness? Did he delay treatment because he was searching for an alternative, or because he was afraid of what abandoning that search would represent? And in the months when he was dying in Germany, surrounded by doctors who couldn't save him, did he ever wish he had made a different choice? The medical record shows that by the time Marley sought aggressive treatment, the cancer was already too advanced. The Bavarian clinic offered hope, but not a cure. Some doctors who reviewed his case later said the amputation might not have saved him anyway. Melanoma that aggressive often spreads before detection. But no one can say for certain. What complicates this further is the timeline. The injury occurred in 1977. The diagnosis came shortly after. If the amputation had been performed immediately, there's a statistical possibility it could have contained the cancer. But statistics aren't certainties. And Marley was being asked to make an irreversible decision based on probabilities, not guarantees. Medical professionals speak in terms of survival rates and 5-year benchmarks. They present choices as risk calculations. But they rarely account for what those choices mean when your body has become public property. When your physical integrity is tied to your cultural legitimacy. When choosing survival might mean losing the very thing that made your survival matter to the people counting on you. It may not have been about faith alone. What we do know is this: Marley spent the last year of his life trying to reconcile two incompatible things. The body that was failing him, and the belief system that required that body to remain intact. He didn't reject medicine. He rejected the version of medicine that required him to become something his followers couldn't recognize. This wasn't about faith. It was about what faith required him to represent. And the cost of that choice was a funeral at 36. The conversations around Marley's death often focus on what he believed. But they rarely focus on the pressure that belief created. The expectation that a global icon would remain consistent. That a man who represented resistance couldn't be seen giving in. That the person carrying the message had to embody it completely, even when it cost him everything. There's another layer here that gets overlooked. Marley wasn't just navigating his own beliefs. He was navigating the beliefs projected onto him. By fans. By critics. By a music industry that had turned him into a commodity. By politicians who used his image for legitimacy. By cultural movements that needed him to remain exactly who they thought he was. His music had transcended borders. One Love. Redemption Song. No Woman, No Cry. Songs that spoke to universal struggle. But that universality came with a burden. He couldn't just be a man making music. He had to be the embodiment of everything that music represented. The records sold because they carried weight beyond melody. They were anthems of liberation, soundtracks to movements, proof that resistance could be beautiful. But that meaning was built on the assumption that Marley himself was immovable. That the man and the message were inseparable. That his body, his choices, his life were all part of a larger testimony that couldn't include weakness. The pressure to be a symbol doesn't come with an off switch. It doesn't pause when you're sick. It doesn't care about private doubts or medical realities. It only cares about what you represent. And what Marley represented was something that couldn't be compromised, even to save his life. In the years since his death, Marley's image has only grown. His face appears on merchandise worldwide. His songs play in commercials. His name is invoked in causes he never endorsed. The symbol has outlived the man so completely that the man himself has almost disappeared. The corporations that once avoided reggae now profit from it. The establishment that marginalized Marley's message now sells it. His image decorates dorm rooms and coffee shops, stripped of context, reduced to aesthetic. The revolution has been repackaged as retail. Marley's legacy is immense. His music outlived him by decades. Rastafari reached audiences he never could have imagined. But the story of how he died is still told in simplifications. Religious refusal. Tragic faith. A cautionary tale about belief over science. What's missing is the question no one asked him directly: what does it mean to be a symbol when symbols aren't allowed to be human? The broader implication extends beyond Marley himself. How many artists, activists, and public figures find themselves trapped in the same paradox? Expected to embody ideals that leave no room for vulnerability. Required to maintain consistency even when circumstances demand adaptation. Pressured to sacrifice personal well-being for collective symbolism. The pattern repeats across generations and movements. Leaders who can't admit exhaustion. Icons who can't show fear. Voices who can't afford to waver because too many people are depending on them to remain steady. The cost gets externalized, absorbed into biography, explained away as martyrdom. Marley's death didn't end the questions. It amplified them. Because in refusing to compromise, he became an even more powerful symbol. His choice, whatever the motivation behind it, reinforced the very image that may have prevented him from seeking earlier treatment. The legend consumed the man completely. And he wasn't the first. He won't be the last. The same pressure would surface again, in voices the world thought it already understood. Some stories end. Legends don't. This is CLS.